let's begin, please. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you, wherever you are. Thank you for this. This is our fourth session of this meeting. And we will start today with a discussion on conforming amendments to ISQM 1, ISQM 2, and ISA 220 as revised. I want to thank Lisbeth for leading this effort. And Lisbeth, of course, will be doing the presentation. Let me remind everybody that we're looking for approval of an exposure draft on these conforming amendments, as this board has done before. So please be brief and as succinct as you can in your observations as we move forward. I don't know if, Ken, is there any administrative detail you would like to mention at this point, or shall we go directly to the agenda item?
Mr. Chairman, if I may just also introduce Natalie Klona-Redis, who is joining us from the IESBA staff. Natalie has been very kind to make herself available for any questions or comments the board might have in relation to the IESBA's work on the quality management standards.
Great. Thank you very much, Natalie, for being with us for this discussion. Okay, we can begin. So let me turn this over to you, Lisbeth.
Thank you, Stavros. So my objective today is to set the record in having the quickest project ever done on record of the IESBA on my name. So let's all try to get this done this evening or this morning, depending on where you are. So actually in this session on conforming amendments, there are a couple of topics on the agenda. First of all, I would like to get some agreement on a minor change to the guide of the code to reflect the changes to the conceptual framework as a result of the role and mindset project. After that, we will have to approve first the project proposal for the conforming amendments to the code project as a result of the new ISQM 1, ISQM 2, and ISA 220 revised standards issued by the IEESB. And once the project proposal is approved, I will guide you then through the changes as proposed by the IESBA staff, being Carla and Ken, and which were reviewed by myself. And as Ken just said, we also got support from Natalie Klona-Redis, the Deputy Director from the IEESB. So I would like to say thank you already now to Natalie for her input and support to the project, and also for the fact that she made herself available to listen into this session now and to assist in case of need with any technical ISQM 1 questions if needed. And this despite that she was actually having other obligations for the IEESB this evening. So thank you very much, Natalie, for that. So first things first, here on screen, you see the minor modification to the guide to the code. The language in paragraph 6 has been updated to reflect the fact that when a PA applies the conceptual framework, they should have an inquiring mind. So you see here on screen the proposed change. Any comments from board members are, just like to hear if there is anyone who has any objection to this change.
Anyone, please, that would like to make a remark on this? I see Deanne. Deanne?
Thank you, Stavros. I was actually wondering whether this change should actually be made earlier as part of the updates to the handbook, because this is I see this as a conforming change arising out of role and mindset.
So this is not part of this project itself. It's just I noted that the change was not yet done. And so I suggested to have it run by the board at the same time as the project that is now. So it's outside of the project itself, if that clarifies your question. So it doesn't have to go through an ED or an approval or anything. It's just we can update it anytime we want.
Yeah, yeah. The role and mindset has been approved anyway. So, okay.
Okay. Galen has a point.
Yes, Galen?
So Elizabeth, I'm looking at the screen here, and I don't the insertion of having an inquiring mind, that certainly makes sense. Are you going to talk about the deletion there, or what? Maybe am I missing something?
Well, the deletion itself is also as a result of the changes to the wording in the role and mindset.
So it's already
project.
changed. It's already changed.
All. So with these changes, so the addition and the deletion, we are now fully aligned to the language in the role and mindset project.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
Okay. So, Lisbeth, are we going to stop here, or are we going to?
We can, if there are no further comments, we can just move forward, because this doesn't have to be formally approved by the board, as and that in contrast with the rest of the session this evening.
Yeah. This is simply an adjustment that flows.
It's simply an adjustment to the guide to the code, so it's outside of the actual ethics code.
Thank you, thank you. So let's proceed then, please.
Okay, then we can go on with the project proposal, and if Carla can put the project proposal on screen. Thank you. So as I said, this is the project proposal for the conforming amendment to the IESBA code as a result of the IAASB quality management standards. As you all know very well, the IAASB issued 3 standards in December 2020, so being the ISQM 1, ISQM 2, and then the ISA 220 revised. Just as a reminder, ISQM 1 relates to quality management for firms performing audits and reviews of financial statements and when performing assurance engagements and other related services. ISQM 2, is dealing with engagement quality reviews, and then ISA 220 revised deals with quality management for an audit of financial statements, which is focusing more at the engagement level than the firm's quality management. And so because of all these new standards, conforming amendments to the code are needed, just simply because our code still refers to the ISQC 1, and also because of the new terminology and the concepts that are used in the quality standards. To be noted is that the revisions that are needed because of ISA 220 revised, and more specifically the definition of engagement team, those, as you know, are being addressed by the engagement team group audit task force as presented to us last Friday. So this project contains revisions needed in part 1, part 3, part 4A and 4B in the glossary of the code. We also agreed that changes that result in more substantive adjustments, so changes that actually are required but that affect the meaning of the provisions within the code, instead of just conforming language to new terms, will not be addressed by this project. So we propose that these will either be addressed by the engagement team group audit task force, or if that is not be possible, then they will be brought to the attention of the planning committee for potentially any future work streams. From a timeline perspective, the objective, as I said, is to have an approval at the end of the session, and the exposure draft will then be issued by end of July, with a 60 days comment period. And then once comment letters are received after that period, we should be able to come back to the board in December for a final approval. And then if that all works out, the effective date is proposed to be aligned to the effective date of the QM standards from the IESB, which is essentially as from the 15th of December 2022. So here is a brief introduction to the project proposal. I think we can now move forward to the approval of the project proposal. And I suggest, Ken, that you take this one over for a second.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Lisbeth. I think before we ask for board approval of the project proposal, let's take a pause and see if any board member has any comments or questions with regard to the project proposal. So the floor is open.
Fine, yes.
Not seeing any comments or questions, no hands raised. So, Mr. Chairman, I would suggest we ask board members to raise hand if everybody is comfortable with the project proposal. So if you could just raise hand, you can just click your Zoom raise hand and we will see your hand raised.
Okay, so raise your Zoom hand if you agree with the project proposal, please.
I see your hand raised, Sanjeev. Thank you. I know you have been having difficulty with your raise hand. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I do think we have unanimity. Jeff, is that correct?
We don't have. I don't think Andy's. We have 16 raised hands now. Actually, I don't think Andy is with us at this stage.
Oh, he's not.
Yeah, we're trying to reach out to him, but other than that, we have 16 raised hands on the screen.
So this is approved anyway.
Yeah.
So we are fine. Thank you. Thank you very much. So it's all present that have voted for, right?
Correct.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Let's proceed.
Very good. So now that the project proposal is approved, we can now kick off the project itself. So in agenda 2B, we presented to you all the changes that this small task force believes have to be made to the extant code. And with extant code, that also includes the recently finished projects like fees, NAS, and role and mindset. So on the first page, the first change is in paragraph 120.15a3. It's a small change, but the reason for the change is to conform with the language in ISQM 1. So the language used there is a quality management system that is designed, implemented, and operated by a firm. On the same page in paragraph 300.7a5, initially we weren't planning to make an adjustment to this paragraph, but the IEESB staff commented that this paragraph may imply that it is the engagement partner who decides whether to accept an engagement for a client. And in fact, per the ISQM 1 and ISA 220 revised, it is the firm that accepts the engagement. However, the engagement partner will confirm whether the firm complied with its policies and procedures in the area of acceptance before the engagement is fully accepted. So based on this comment and to avoid any misunderstanding, we decided to remove that last bit of the sentence. Going further down to paragraph 320.3a4, this is actually an important change. So first of all, we remove the reference to reasonable assurance. Given per ISQM1, the reasonable assurance concept is at the level of the system of quality management. So there is no reference any longer to an individual policy or procedure providing reasonable assurance. Secondly, as you know, the ISQM1 defines quality objectives. And so one of these quality objectives is the firm being able to perform an engagement in accordance with professional standards and applicable legal and regulatory requirements. So under the ISQM1, the firm first needs to identify the quality risks that could lead to a situation where the firm would not be meeting such quality objective as defined under ISQM1. So in other words, if we translate that into language of the code, it means that there might be a threat that the firm has implemented policies and procedures to cover the quality risks and to meet the quality objectives that in effect are deficient, and so not being able to meet the quality objective. So in our view, the threat to assigning individuals who lack required professional competence and so hence not meeting the quality objective is higher when the policies and procedures installed by the firm's system of quality control are not effective, and in that case, remediation is needed. So what we try to do here in this paragraph is we try to align the language in this factor to the language used in ISQM1, while we are still trying to remain as close as possible to the terminology of factors that are relevant when assessing threats, as we are using normally within the code. So those are the main changes to this specific bullet as one of the factors, but it's an important change. Moving on then to paragraph 330.4a2. That change is actually similar to what I just explained. So we aligned the concepts of threats within the code with the concepts of quality, objective, quality, risk, and policies or procedures implemented by the firm. And so with that, we come to the end of part 1 and 3. So I will pause here for a moment to hear if there are any concerns with regards to the changes to these two parts. I want to share with you that we did get advanced comments on these paragraphs from a board member and their TA. And actually the main suggestion was to add references to the specific paragraphs in ISQM1 within each of the provisions in the code. But we quickly discussed this within the task force, but we actually advise against that approach simply because we never did it before. And additionally, if there is a change made to the ISQM1 by the IAASB at some later point, that will then also mean an update is required to the code. But we do appreciate the suggestion, so we will, however, in the explanatory memorandum and the basis for conclusion, add such paragraph references as much as possible. And then there was also a comment on that paragraph where we removed the decision from the engagement partner on acceptance of the engagement. The comment was challenging the fact that there doesn't seem to be a person any longer making this sort of decision. But as I explained just before, this is how ISQM1 unfortunately is written, or fortunately. But additionally note that the ultimate responsibility for quality management remains with the firm's CEO. So there is still a person to point to. So I open the floor for any comments on part 1 and 3.
Stavros, you're on mute.
Thank you very much, Lisbeth. Any remarks, please, on what was presented up to section 330?
We have one raised hand from Caroline.
Caroline, please.
Thank you. Thanks, Lisbeth, and congratulations on getting the project proposal passed. Just going back to what you just described, which is 300.7A5. I agree that it's the firm that makes the decision, but when it comes to decisions about accepting a client or providing a service, I think it's the engagement partner that performs that control in ensuring that the firm's policies and procedures are complied with. And I know of several jurisdictions where the engagement has to be under the name of a professional accountant, so a specific PAPP and not just the firm. Sometimes it's because the licensing is rests with the individual. So whilst I don't have an issue with the deletion of the wording that's proposed, I think this is something that should be highlighted in the explanatory memo so that local or national standard setters and PAOs understand the rationale for this. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. Any other remarks, please?
We have a raised hand from Laurie. Mr. Chancellor.
Laurie, please.
Yeah, I had a similar comment to Caroline. And I guess I was a little confused about maybe even, I agree with everything she said. There are many jurisdictions where the licensing sits with the individual, not the firm, or in some jurisdictions, both the individual and the firm, but the individual has certainly responsibility, even statutory responsibility around some of these decisions. But the other question I had is it really necessary? Because it talks about the engagement partner having authority within the firm, which of course, yeah. So we're sort of nodding to in there that it is a firm decision, but the engagement partner has authority. And I just wondered if we need to do it at all. I understand the IESBA point, but I'm just not sure that it carries the day on this, given the points Caroline made, which I agree with.
Thank you, Laurie. Lisbeth, let me see if there is any other, and then you'll respond. I don't see any other. Jeff, do you see something?
We have a raised hand from Rich just now.
Rich, yes.
I have a comment also on 307A5, but it might be a little different in some ways. It struck me that the lead in there talks about a professional accountant's evaluation of the level of threat, and that the engagement partner having authority within the firm for decisions complies with fundamental principles. But I would have thought that the engagement partner still also has responsibility, at least for the services provided to the client. And I'm not so sure they don't have a responsibility to make sure that the decision to accept the client was in accordance with the firm's, or would also have responsibility if they're going to be the person signing the opinion, and particularly in jurisdictions where you have to put your name down. So I don't know if, just throw that out for consideration.
Okay, thank you, Rich. Lisbeth.
Well, I see some merit in some of the comments being made. The question is, are we feeling comfortable with addressing those in the basis for conclusion or in the explanatory memorandum by referring to the expectations under ISA 220 revised? Or is the general feeling that we should reinstate it and run the risk that it is being misunderstood as per ISQM 1 and ISA 220 revised. I also would like to hear, actually, if Natalie has any further thoughts on the comment made with respect to responsibilities being assigned to individuals in certain jurisdictions, how that is being addressed in the ISQM 1 and the ISA 220 revised.
Natalie?
Great. Thank you. And thank you, Elizabeth, for the warm introduction as well. Certainly when we discussed this, this piece, when we were developing the standard, some of the conversations that we had was that there could be circumstances where it's not necessarily the engagement partner that is actually performing that action of doing the background checks or whatever is involved in terms of doing the client acceptance, that in some situations, particularly where it's a new client to the firm, that it actually may be somebody else in the firm that is actually gathering all that information and making that decision whether to accept the client. This isn't actually really something that's very different from the standards today. So if you look at ISQC 1 and ISA 220 today, it has a very similar way that it's actually been set up in terms of the firm making the decision and the engagement partner being satisfied that appropriate procedures were actually performed. So that's just maybe to shed some light on some of the conversations we had.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Yeah.
Let me see, Elizabeth, if somebody, especially I see that people with practice experience have a bit of discomfort about maybe we're not covering what should be covered here.
I see Caroline would like to come back on this.
Caroline, can you help in this?
Thanks, Stavros. So listen, having listened to Natalie's comment that this is the case currently, so then there isn't really a need to make that deletion, as in whether it's under ISQC 1 or ISQM 1, there doesn't seem to be a difference in the position.
Okay. Laurie wants to come back as well.
Yeah, I agree with that. That's sort of my original point. I hearing everything, I don't think the deletion is needed. And, and I understand in firms that often there are people around acceptance or other decisions who are doing, the background work and providing the information. But certainly my experience has been the engagement leader is the one who has both the responsibility and the authority to make ultimate decisions versus, preparing the underlying information. And certainly from a regulatory standpoint and inspection standpoint, regulators would look to the engagement partner as the ultimate decision maker on engagements. Rich may comment on that, but that's certainly my experience in terms of how that gets looked at. So I think we could do without that change.
Yeah.
Thank you. Rich, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I would just agree with Laurie. I think you don't need to make the deletion. The point is that the individual is still going to have to be responsible, and we should be saying that to the point about even the regulatory inspections, to Laurie's point. Thank you.
And I see Ian's hand going up.
Hi, Elizabeth, and I appreciate the chairman never likes drafting suggestions on the run here, but as someone who's a long way away from this, but I would say you could just say including within the firm, including making or informing decisions about acceptance, about accepting or providing services. So either making or informing decisions would cover both circumstances, it seems to me.
Okay. And then we have Brian as well.
Thanks, Elizabeth.
Yes, Brian.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Oh, sorry, I'm getting a bit of an echo. all I wanted to do was chime in and agree, particularly from the enforcement perspective. I don't think it's problematic to leave that example in there. I think it's practically true, and it does provide a good example of the situation. So, thanks.
So what I'm hearing is that the preference is to keep it in, and what we can do is attract the attention on this point in the explanatory memorandum and ask respondents about views on this change. With respect to Ian's proposal, perhaps Ken and Carla, we can see if we can make some further changes, or do we have to do it immediately now on the spot here?
Well, Lisbeth, I think you have a bit of a sense of the board. I mean, if the board is comfortable keeping the extent language, I would go with that, okay. And not try to wordsmith different wording options.
Okay, good. Yep. So we will go with that approach. We keep what is, and we add a specific paragraph on this in the explanatory memorandum and ask for input from respondents.
Yeah.
Brian, your hand is still up. Do you have any further comments? Okay, thank you. Then we can move on to part 4. So 400.4, the main adjustment here is the change from the reference to ISQC1 to ISQM1, and then further aligning the language to ISQM1. First of all, by again referring to designing, implementing, and operating a system of quality management, and then also the language around firm, network firms, and service providers. Also note the removal of reasonable assurance also here, because the concept is only used in the context of achieving the overall objectives in paragraph 14 of the ISKM1, rather than on individual components or individual quality objectives. And then also a pretty important change, we decided to include the specific reference to the individual who is responsible for independence compliance, as is specifically called out in ISKM1. And the main reason why we did this is that we believe that this change here will also now better address the concern that previously was made by respondents to the structure exposure draft, where the commenters actually believed the use of the term "the firm" throughout part 4 made it basically impossible from an enforcement perspective to hold an individual responsible for compliance in the area of independence compliance. So I think with this change, we achieve that, or we address that comment that was made at the time as well. Then on R400.53, and actually that in combination with 400.53A4 on the next page. So this is with respect to the definition of a network firm. It's another difficult one actually. So the IESBA staff explained to us that in the context of a network and network firms, it's actually more than just about common policies and procedures. So ISKM1 refers, as you know, to network requirements and network services, whereas policies and procedures are only covering responses to the quality objectives and the quality risks. So when looking at whether an entity or an organization is a network firm, it is actually expected that in most instances, networks might share common objectives and risks, but most probably policies and procedures will differ. However, when the IEESB was drafting the ISKM1, they kept on purpose the reference to policies or procedures with respect to network firms, as it did not want to create inconsistencies with the extant IESBA code. So when we were discussing this point, it was suggested to enhance the application material in 400.53A4 to better explain the meaning of quality management policies and procedures in the context of ISKM1 and networks. But when we were focusing on the potential drafting of this, we decided that this was actually a substantive change and not really a conforming amendment. So the proposal here is to have this matter addressed by the engagement team group audit task force, and this in close coordination with the ISKM1 task force to ensure that we don't create any inconsistencies with the ISKM1. So no real changes except for minor reference to management policies or procedures. Then 400.80A1, here we also removed the term reasonable assurance for the same reason as I explained before. Then moving on to 400.74A1, 73A1, sorry. That is to align the language to the wording in the new fees provisions, and that will actually also align to the language as is currently proposed by the engagement team group audit task force regarding engagement quality reviews. Then we can go further down to our 540.4. Sorry, 410.4A1 is again the language designed, implemented, and operated. So let's not move a lot of time on this one. Let's move straight to our 540.4. As you can see here, we actually did not align the language here to quality management for the audit engagement as is being used in the ISKM1, because if we would have done that, we would have extended the meaning of the sentence, as there are many people in a firm performing different functions related to the system of quality management. And so as a result of that, if we would have made that change, this would actually result in a substantive change. And so again, that is outside the remit of this project. And we also would like to propose to forward that adjustment to the engagement team group audit task force when as part of their revision of the definition of auditing. Then going further to our 540.5, no, going back up, there isn't. Yeah, there you see the removal of control out of the term engagement quality control review. Now under ISKM 1 and 2, it's called EQR, so the engagement quality review. Then our 540.12, that's the same change as I just explained, the same in our 15 and 16, so also exactly the same change. And then gets us to our 540.20. Here is the same problem on changing quality control into quality management. That would indeed extend the meaning again. So this is all forwarded, also forwarded to the engagement team group audit task force. And that brings us then to our 800.10. So in this point BI on consultations. We had actually no intention to make a change, but the IEESB staff explained to us that in the ISQM1, the term on consultation is actually used in a broader context than just consultations on technical or industry-specific issues, transactions, and events. And so, and the question was also raised whether this specific reference would also include individuals dealing with differences of opinion. And again, also here, based on these comments, if we would make any changes here, it would in effect be more substantive than just the conforming amendment. So also here, we propose to forward it to the engagement team group audit task force as part of their revision of the term audit team. And then when they go into exposure, they can explain that change if needed. And then also with respect to II, so BII, same point as before. If we would have changed it into quality management for the engagement, then that would also be a more substantive change. So this should also be addressed by the engagement team group audit task force. And that takes us then to Part 4B, and I'll run through this quickly as well because they are similar as what I was just saying. So for instance, in the first paragraph, 900.3, it's exactly similar changes as I just explained for Part 4A. Also going further down, also the same comment comes back on quality control, quality management, and then also when you run further down, also the point on consultation, as I made just now. And so these points should also go for review by the engagement team group audit task force. And that is basically it on Part 4A and 4B. So I suggest again to pause here before we dive into the glossary to see if there are any comments on these changes.
Okay. So requesting comments on the conforming changes, Part 4A, 4B. Any remarks, please? I see Sung Nam has raised a hand. Sung Nam?
I'm here. On paragraph, the very first paragraph, 400.4.
Okay.
All right, here, yeah, I agree to the alignment with ISQM1. But my comment is on the parenthesis in the middle. Right after including, I believe the network should be added to make it aligned with ISQM, paragraph 29B. Please take a look at it.
Can you be more specific? Where do you think
yes,
you...
Yeah, there, including.
Including network firms and individuals.
The network and the network firms. So
okay.
we need to add the network.
Yeah, okay.
This is the same case for paragraph 900.3.
Yeah, okay.
And also the other comment is on 500.5B.
Is it this one?
Oh, yeah, hold on. Yeah, 5. Yeah, the next one, next paragraph. Yes, the B. This change was already reflected in our final EQR related revisions pronounced in January. So I believe we need to take it out from our exposure draft.
Oh, so it was already in there.
Right.
Okay, so it was already adjusted. Yeah, okay, I see what you're
In
saying.
January,
Yeah.
yes.
Okay, but I suggest that we leave it in here as a change because we're making changes. But it's a very good point you're making. But we should be pointing out in the explanatory memorandum that even in the EQR exposure draft, this was removed. Yeah, thank you for
Okay.
pointing that out. Yeah, good point.
The same case, the next one.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
512, right?
Yeah, okay, that's fine. Yeah, we will address that in the explanatory memorandum. Okay.
Good.
Thank you.
Yes,
Thank
sir.
you.
Sadia?
Yes,
Sadia?
I'm looking. Yes, but I'm looking to support you in the quickest project ever done. And thank you to the work of the team already done on this project. I'm going to point out something obvious, and what's going to happen is when we reach a point of this project, we're going to have quality management and quality control used in the same code. And while we understand the reasoning for it, and I'm not disputing that we're treating it in the correct way, it might become difficult when we're using the code in a year's time. That a user might see quality control and see quality management. So I'm sure you've already considered how to address this here in the explanatory memorandum for exposure draft period. But can I ask if we can consider how we would be addressing it in the handbook? Because this inconsistency, if I estimate, might be for 2 years, because the differences would be the difference in the effective date of the QM standards versus the effective date of ISA 600. Thank you.
Okay. That's a good point you're making, Sadia. We, of course, are proposing a definition for quality control review. It's not really quality control per se in the glossary, but I think it's indeed something that we should point out specifically in the explanatory memorandum. Are you suggesting to include it in the guide to the code as well, or is the explanatory memorandum for you sufficient?
I think
or a basis for conclusions, I should say.
I like the suggestion of the explanatory memorandum, and we can hear back what readers would feel would be most handy.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah.
Yep.
It's the exposure draft.
Yeah.
Okay. Rich Huskin?
Yes, thank you. Back to 400.4, I apologize for taking you all the way back there. I realize that the first half of that paragraph, including that parenthetical that Sunam referenced, I believe is word for word out of the ISQM. But I find it interesting that we are going to say that we have a requirement to apply system of quality management over relevant ethical requirements are required of the firm, ... all the way it ends with and service providers or service providers, when in fact the ethical standards don't address third-party service providers. And I believe the IESBA made it clear service providers meant third parties. So I don't know whether we need to address that or not, but I'll just throw that out for consideration. And then the second question I had was, at the end of that paragraph, it says, a firm assigns operational responsibility for clients for independence requirements to individuals in accordance with ISQM 1. Are you referring to individuals within the organization and excluding the engagement team members, including the lead audit partner who is required to, is absolutely responsible for the independence on that engagement? So I'm just kind of curious what was intended with that.
The intention of this one is the reference to the individual who's responsible for independence per ISQM 1. That individual is specifically called out in ISQM 1.
Yeah, I know.
That's the reference here.
Okay, thank you. What about the service providers then, Elizabeth? Have you thought about that?
To be honest, I haven't really focused too much on this. But Ken, do you want to say a couple of words on this one?
Yeah. My recommendation to the board would be to align with ISQM 1 because that is basically the conceptual underpinning to an engagement team. That is anybody who's engaged to perform procedures on the audit engagement, and that would include service providers. The service providers, as defined in ISKM 1, will include, and ISO 600 going forward as revised, will include component auditors, whether in-ward or, well, actually service providers will be out of network, so it would include component auditors outside the network. But I think it would be a bit of an omission not to include service providers, because that is what is already settled in ISKM 1 now.
Caroline?
Thanks, Ross. Yes, and just to add to what Ken has mentioned, that actually the engagement team group audit independence task force is planning to look at service providers and provisions in relation to service providers. So it will come in.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's helpful, Caroline. I appreciate that.
And Sungnan, thank you for your comment in the chat box. So yeah, I agree with you. So it should be including the network firms, and then individuals in the network or network firms. Yeah.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
Carla, if you can make that change on screen, please.
It's very confusing to read.
Yeah, it's a lot of networks. I agree with you.
Okay, Sungnam, you have another point? Your hand
Oh,
is...
no.
Okay.
Okay.
And Galen.
Yeah.
Galen.
Yes, just a very minor one, but 400.53A4, and if you can bring that up, and in that paragraph, it talks about design implemented, and then it skips to monitoring. It skips over operating. Is there a reason for that? Because everywhere else, it seems like we say designed, implemented, operating, but we don't have it
actually a
here.
good catch. Yeah, I think we overlooked this one. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I don't see any other hand. I don't see any other hand, Lisbeth.
Good. So that gets us to page 11, the glossary.
Yes, the glossary.
And this one will go normally very quickly. No, the glossary, Carla, you're one step too far. Yep, there you are. So assurance team. So yeah, here it's the same as we just discussed on the point on consultation and the point on quality control. So these will be for review by the ISKM 1. What am I saying? Sorry, the group audit engagement team task force. Also important to note is in the term of audit team, at the bottom there is reference to senior or managing partner or chief executive or equivalent, whereas in ISKM 1 they are using the term chief executive officer or managing partner, or if appropriate, the firm's managing board of partners. And so given this extended group of individuals, also here our proposal is to have the engagement team group audit task force to look at this as part of their revisions to the term audit team. As again, this is more than just a conforming amendment, it's really extending the definition. Also, with respect to C in the definition of audit team, the IESB staff asked whether the reference to network firm should be rather network, given ISQM 1 refers to network and firms within the network, and other organizations are structures within the network. And also here, this is actually a substantive matter again, so we would also like to suggest that the engagement team group audit task force, as part of the revisions to the term audit team, looks at this in more detail. Then moving down to page 12, there you see that we have added some definitions. So for instance, the engagement quality reviewer, this definition actually comes from ISQM 1, but it's also included in the final pronouncement on engagement quality review. And then we also updated the term of engagement quality review to align to the term in ISQM 1. With respect to network, there, we make the changes as we discussed before, so R400.53. And then with respect to review team, again, the same comments on consultation and quality control for the engagement, and also on point C, those within network firm. So all these points we're moving forward, or we're forwarding, I should say, to the engagement team group audit task force. And that takes us then to pages 13 and 14, and those are basically adjustments to reflect appropriate abbreviations. So nothing of any serious importance here, apart from conforming amendments. So are there any further concerns or any further points that anyone would like to make on the changes in the glossary or in the list of abbreviations?
Inviting your remarks, please.
Okay, I don't see any further comments, Mr. Chairman.
No, I don't either.
Excellent. So that is all for me. So I think we can then move forward with the voting on the exposure draft, Ken. So I'll
absolutely.
hand
Thank
it
you
back
very much.
over to you.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Isba. That's been great. So with that, I would ask the board members to vote for approval of the exposure draft. If you're in favor, if you could raise your hand in Zoom.
In favor, raise your hand, please.
Sungnam, are you? Okay. Okay, we have 18 members. That's excellent. Unanimous.
Unanimous. No one. Okay. Very good. Excellent. Thank you very much. And thank Lisbeth and the staff for very painstaking work, which of course has its value. So thank you, Carla. Thank you, Lisbeth. And thank you all for this. The next step is that this is going to go out for how long now? For what's 60 days?
60 days. 60. So it will go out end of July with a 60 days comment period.
Yeah. And staff will prepare a draft explanatory memorandum, which staff will share with the board for a review and comment on a favorable basis. We will include all the items that were flagged during the board session today, as Lisbeth has indicated. So there will be the few areas we have identified. There will be additional questions, specific questions would ask stakeholders to comment on. So the board will have an opportunity to review the draft package before it gets finalized for issuance.
Okay. And the plan is to have this for final approval in December.
Correct.
Correct.
Okay, so I can close this item on the agenda. Thanking you again very much, Lisbeth, staff, and thank you all. Perhaps, Ken, we could go on a break now before we proceed to our other item on the agenda, which is benchmarking update. So let's go off for a 15-minute break. Let's come back at 15 minutes after the hour. We're on the hour right now. And I hope Laura is going to be available for, yes? Okay, because we're going a bit earlier than planned.
No problem, Stavros, I'm here.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you very much. Break. We can begin again. Hello, hello. We are now after the fastest project proposal that we enjoyed before. We're going to the second item on our agenda, which is an update on the benchmarking project. And I want to welcome Laura Friedrich, who is heading the head of the task force, the working group on that. And Laura, please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Stavros, and good day, everyone. And thanks also, Diana, for managing the slides for me, just as you. Okay, so we can move ahead then to the first slide, please. So we have a fairly brief update for you today to fill you in on our progress on phase 1 of the benchmarking initiative and where we're headed, and also to get your initial thoughts on both the areas of focus that we're specifically pursuing and on our current thinking on the plan for developing the deliverables for this first phase, specifically the final report. And just before I forget, I also want to mention that we've made some minor editorial and formatting corrections in the cover note, and the updated copy has been uploaded to the website at this point for you. Slide, please. So just as a quick reminder of the working group members, and actually a bit of an update as well, I'm joined on the group by Rich Huskin, Kristen Weidel, and Richard Fleck. And we've got a new member who has just joined us. Pete Osler has kindly agreed to join us and share his expertise. And he's the Global Ethics and Independence Lead at RSM out of London. Has a lot of experience with the SEC requirements as well as the IESBA code. And I see that he's also here with us today. So welcome, Pete, and thanks for joining us. We're happy to have you on board, and we're really looking forward to working with you and benefiting from your expertise in this area as well. In terms of staff on the project,
let me echo the welcome to Peter. Thank you very much for joining us on this. Thank you.
In terms of staff on the project, Sylvia Schramko is doing the heavy lifting for us with oversight and guidance from Deanne Jules. And the working group has met 3 times since we last reported to you in March. Please. So you'll recall that at the March board meeting, we walked through our plan for the phase 1 comparison. Phase 1, as you know, is the comparison of the SEC and PCAOB rules to the code's international independence standard. And at that time, we were intending to provide a comparison on essentially all of the topics or issues in the code and the SEC requirements and have that in the report. But there were some concerns about this approach, concerns that we had ourselves, and ones that were also voiced by several board members. And these centered on the complexity inherent in that approach. And we're not just talking about the volume here or the fact that the standards are sometimes complicated to interpret. That was certainly a factor, but the real caution was that because of the different approaches that are taken by the SEC requirements and the code, the comparison are not just apples to apples, especially when we're looking at provisions that are not an outright prohibition, but instead require consideration of facts and circumstances to make the evaluation. In the code, of course, this happens regularly with respect to applying the conceptual framework, but it happens in the context of the SEC requirements as well. And the different approaches and different ways that these sets of standards are used in different jurisdictions leads to some sensitivities and interpretive challenges. So the concern was that if we tried to present a comparison of all topics, we'd run into resource limitations, which might then jeopardize future phases of the project. And even more importantly, we'd likely end up with a bit of a behemoth in terms of the final report. The report would be fully comprehensive, but it would include topic areas that would be less relevant to many readers, and its sheer volume would be overwhelming and therefore less useful. So to alleviate these concerns, what we're planning to do is focus our attention where it matters most. In other words, focusing on the topics that are of greatest interest to stakeholders rather than presenting all of the topics at a heading by heading level. And I'm going to spend most of our time today outlining the issues that we've identified as being of greatest importance and getting any additional ideas from board members. And I'll come back to this in just a minute. But the second point here that I'm going to close off quickly, we were cautioned by a couple of board members that they thought that readers might interpret the benchmarking comparisons as rulemaking outside the code, or that they might see the report as interpretive. So we just want to emphasize and assure the board that we're aware of the need to be very careful in terms of how we highlight the similarities and the substantive differences between the two sets of standards, and how we present the results of the evaluations. And we'll be particularly cautious when making comparisons that include issues where application of the conceptual framework is required. Okay, and yes, you're on the correct slide already for me. Thank you. Okay, so as I mentioned, our current approach is to prioritize and focus in on the areas or topics of greatest interest to stakeholders to ensure that we put our resources and attention where it matters most. The scope of the project overall hasn't changed. It continues to be comparing the IIS and the SEC PCAOB rules, but we're trying to be smart and efficient about the approach. So we're essentially taking a stakeholder interest-based approach. And I want to stress that in no way are we trying to imply that the requirements that we're prioritizing are the most important ones. Obviously, all of the requirements of both of the frameworks are essential. What we're focusing on are just the areas where the comparisons between the two frameworks are the most relevant to stakeholders. So to determine these areas of focus, the working group considered the full scope of both sets of standards, and then we narrowed in based on questions and practical issues that have been raised by stakeholders that the group is aware of from our collective experience. Things like discussions that have come up in the context of the NAS revisions and informal comparisons that have been done at the firm level and so on. And just to be clear, we're not just looking at areas or topics where there are substantive differences. Differences are important, of course, but we're also looking for areas where there are strong similarities. And we particularly want to ensure that we explain how the two sets of standards might take different approaches, but get to very similar outcomes, especially for topics where there might have been some confusion in the marketplace in the past about how the code's principles-based approach and the building blocks architecture, how those achieve very strong outcomes vis-a-vis jurisdictional rules. And of course, we'll also be looking to emphasize the additional strengthening of the independence provisions that have been realized through the revisions from the NAS and the FEES projects. So we've focused in on a set of key topics, and I'll outline those for you today. And the sneak preview of the focus areas is on the right-hand side of the slide here, based on the list of sections in Part 4A. And there's more detail in the appendix to our cover note, and I'm going to walk through the areas that we've identified next. But before I do that, I just want to emphasize that the list we've pulled together reflects our discussions to date. But we are definitely looking for input from the board on other areas of particular interest where attention should be given. And going forward, we also intend to have some targeted discussions with a few stakeholders who have particular insight in these areas. So let's take a look at the focus areas that we've identified so far. This slide lays out those key areas, and I'll walk through each area next to give a bit more context of what we're thinking and why we've selected that area. But just a quick note, the first two areas, the overarching principles and approach and the definitions, these are grouped together because they will form the introductory section of the comparison that'll provide context for the evaluations performed in the rest of the focus areas. So let me walk through each of these boxes in turn then, if we can go to the next slide. So right up front in the project and ultimately in the report as well, up front is a comparison of the overarching principles and approaches of the two sets of standards, the SEC PCAOB rules and the code. And in this opening section of the benchmarking report, we'll highlight that although there are differences in approaches and context, there's significant similarities in terms of objectives and outcomes. There are strengths and drawbacks to each approach, of course, but in a lot of ways, the two approaches are examples of different methods of getting to the same or very similar outcomes. The main conceptual difference between the code's provisions and those of the SEC and PCAOB rules comes from their contexts. So the SEC PCAOB rules were developed for a particular jurisdiction, the US of course, and in that jurisdiction, their rules are directly applicable and enforceable. Code, on the other hand, obviously is global in nature. It's written for a much broader audience, and its application relies on national laws and regulations in each jurisdiction. So then, naturally, the different contexts lead to different approaches. And historically, those approaches have been described by some stakeholders being rules-based versus principles-based. But as we've demonstrated in our previous presentations to you, both sets of requirements actually rely on both principles and rules or requirements. So in our benchmarking work at the sort of big picture level, we're comparing the general standard in Rule 201B of the SEC requirements with the code, particularly with respect to the fundamental principles and the application of the conceptual framework. So parts 1 and then sections 300 and 400. We went through this overview at a high level last year for you. This includes, for example, the concept of the reasonable and informed third party versus the reasonable investor, and also the concepts around self-review and advocacy and so on. Another overarching concept is the area of management responsibilities. And both the SEC and the code include a prohibition on assuming management responsibilities, as you know, but the SEC rules also make direct reference to employee functions as well, whereas the code would address the relevant threats and safeguards more broadly, for example, through the application of the conceptual framework and the self-review threat prohibition in NAS. So again, a different approach, which might be very similar in terms of objectives and outcomes, especially at that management level, but it might also represent some specific differences at the employee level. And then finally, at this high level, we've included the NOCLAR provisions. We're not doing a full comparison of NOCLAR, but we include it and plan to include it, if and where necessary to address any of the specific SEC or PCAOB requirements. Noting also, though, that some of the parallels to NOCLAR are found actually in other areas of U.S. regulation. So again, there are jurisdictional differences that we'll need to factor in as we work through these. Slide, please. Okay, next, and this is also at the high level, are the definitions. And what we're doing is evaluating the definitions up front so that we can apply the various definitions throughout the comparison, and so that we can refer readers back to those comparative definitions as we continue on throughout the benchmarking. We all know the devil's in the details, and it's the definitions that drive those details. Some of the definitions that are obviously important to the exercise are those on the slide here. By and large, there's lots of congruence here, but there are also some differences between definitions that we'll need to be careful of as we continue throughout the comparisons. And just as a general rule with respect to definitions, we'll obviously also need to keep an eye on changes to definitions that are being proposed in other IESBA projects, such as the definitions of engagement team or audit team under the Engagement Team Group Audit Independence Project. And next slide, please. So the overarching approach and the definitions, those set the overall context and then carry through all of the detailed topics that we'll be covering. And the first of those detailed topics then is in the area of fees, which we know is of particular interest to stakeholders, and where the recent changes to the code under the fees project have strengthened the code's requirements since the last time that any significant benchmarking exercise was performed. Requirements regarding fees is another area where our comparison has to take into account the difference in scope between the SEC rules and the code that arise because of those jurisdictional differences. So for example, while the code includes requirements around fee dependency, it's not in the SEC mandate to regulate fees in that respect. So for comparison purposes, we plan to focus on the areas of contingent fees and the public disclosure requirements of fee-related information, because these are the areas where both the code and the SEC or PCAOB rules include requirements. And those areas that are in the code but are not covered in the SEC framework, we can include those in a general overview piece. So in terms of the comparisons of these two topics themselves, where we can make the comparisons, we note that the approaches between the code and the SEC framework are a bit different. For example, based on whether materiality of contingent fees are considered or not, and whether the public disclosure requirements are directed at the auditor or at the audit client. So we'll be evaluating, again, the extent of differences and similarities here. And note that disclosure to those charged with governance is also on our list of key areas, but we've pulled it out as a separate topic. So the fee-related disclosures to those charged with governance are actually going to be included there. And I'll get to that in just a few minutes. And next slide, please. Okay, moving on then to NAS. And this is the area that we know is of greatest interest to the majority of stakeholders, and also, of course, the other area where the independent standards have been strengthened recently. So the NAS provisions will be compared and presented in their entirety. Rest assured, this is an area that we know needs very careful attention. So to do that, we've broken out the more general matters that describe the overall approach of the code and the SEC or PCAOB rules with respect to the provision of NAS to audit clients. And these matters, they're the ones that are based on our work so far. We understand that these are really important and also viewed somewhat sensitively by stakeholders of all different kinds. So similar to what we're doing in the project overall, and by that I mean comparing the overall approaches first and then looking at key topics, we're going to do the same kind of thing here specific to NAS. So we're preparing an evaluation that describes the bigger picture concepts and the similarities and differences in approach before we look at the specific requirements in the NAS subsections. Some of the bigger picture concepts that we're including here are the way that the SEC's not subject to audit exception compares to the code's self-review threat prohibition. So the two approaches here have different starting points, but they often end up in exactly the same place. So in other words, the SEC approach starts with an empty set, so to speak, and then scopes specific activities in, while the code starts with a full set and then scopes things out. Either way, you can end up with the same set of allowable activities, but we need to do a systematic review of what ends up in or out for the different NAS categories that include the SEC's not subject to audit exception. And other areas where we need to dig in and get to the core of the similarities and any differences include determining where the line is drawn with respect to providing advice and recommendations, how materiality factors in or doesn't, especially in light of changes and clarifications regarding materiality that were made during the NAS project to the NAS provisions, and how the advocacy thread is addressed in each set of standards with respect to NAS. And we'll also be keeping a close eye on changes to the NAS provisions that are coming out of the work of the Technology Task Force and the effects that these will have on our comparisons as well. And next slide, please. So those points relate to sort of those general matters with respect to the provision of NAS. But as I mentioned, we're doing a full evaluation of the subsections. And an important point to note here is that the code and the SEC or PCAOB framework, they cover very similar categories of services with respect to NAS. And this table provides the cross-referencing between the two frameworks that we'll be working with. A couple of quick notes on the SEC and PCAOB column. The first is that some of the names have been shortened here on this slide, but you can refer to them in our cover note in the appendix. The full reference is there if you're interested. And again, some of the formatting has been updated there. The second note is that there's no actual section of SEC rules on administrative services, hence the quotation marks around the name in the second row there of the SEC side of the table. For this piece of the comparison, then we'll be referencing the SEC's general standard and also some of the commentary that's provided in some of their public documents. And I should also note that this is one of the areas where several of the PCAOB rules will also be particularly relevant to our work. as they complement the SEC rules with respect to, for example, tax services. And next slide, please. So as I mentioned earlier, we've pulled out communication with those charged with governance as a separate topic for evaluation here individually, rather than including it under both NAS and fees. And in these areas, the code has a fair amount of content here, again, by virtue of the fact that the requirements are being written for a global and varied audience as opposed to being written for a single jurisdiction. So we'll look at this in general terms, but we'll also need to dig further in here and see how the actual outcomes might differ. As we know, these areas are of keen interest to stakeholders as well. And again, this is another area where we specifically will be considering some of the PCAOB rules that complement the SEC rules. And next slide, please. Okay, the last three areas that we've identified as key for comparison are on the slide here. And again, we'll be looking to give a general overview of the approaches and then also look in more depth at the similarities and substantive differences, if any. So with respect to financial relationships, we've done some preliminary work here, and the requirements seem broadly equivalent, but there are some specific differences that we're still looking at. For business relationships, the SEC rules are more specific about who the requirements relate to. In other words, who the auditor can't have a business relationship with. And there's also no allowance there for materiality in the case of direct business relationships. The code, of course, focuses on threats related to close business relationships and deals with specific types of relationships with consideration given in terms of materiality or significance. So again, a bit of a different approach there. And in terms of partner rotation, the objectives there are broadly the same, but again, there are some specific differences that generally arise in that situation in terms of time on and time off requirements. Each of these areas is important, obviously, and in each, the underlying objectives are largely the same, but there are some specific differences in presentation or approach or in specific requirements that we're looking at. So our job for these, and as with all of the key areas that we've identified, our job is to highlight the similarities, determine if the differences are meaningful or not in terms of the outcomes, and then we need to present this efficiently for readers to provide an updated and clear comparison of the areas where those comparisons matter most to stakeholders. Okay, and next slide. So these are the key areas that we've identified so far based on our work to date, but I'll pause here and gather any ideas that you might have on additional topics that you think that we should ensure that we focus on. And again, we're looking for areas where the comparisons will be most useful to stakeholders, where there are anticipated differences that are meaningful from a practical perspective in terms of outcomes, and especially also where stakeholders might be assuming that there are meaningful differences, but in fact there really might not be. We'd like to hear those as well. Okay, so Stavros, I'll turn it over to you at this point to collect comments.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Laura. Well, the floor is open for any remarks that you have. You've heard what Laura wanted, specific areas that are not identified that might be interesting to look into. Anyone? Galen, please.
Thank you, Chair. So I think the approach that I heard really does make a lot of sense in drilling down and digging into these. And of course, I'd always want more comparison rather than less. In particular, gifts and hospitality, I would love to see something on that, but I understand the focus approach and maybe later type of thing. The one thing that does come to mind a little bit here is the SEC has a lot of FAQs that are really considered authoritative in their own sense. And I don't know whether you're going to stop at, say, Regulation 201, Regulation SX, or whether you're going to go further. I just throw that out there and would be interested in your comment on it because I'm sure that you're probably aware of those FAQs. In particular, partner rotation. There's a lot of different examples. How are you going to treat that, I guess was my question.
Thank you, Galen. Laura, you don't mind if we collect some views and then you can respond?
Yeah, please go
Vanya?
ahead.
Okay, Vanya?
Travis, I would just like to give my support to Laura. I love the presentation, and I think it is something so important for us that are doing with standards and regulations to know what other regulations are already putting in place, so we can avoid, for example, companies that are subject to more than one and they are not compatible at all, and they are looking for the same thing. So it is so important for us to know what is already there, so we can benefit from it, or we can make associations with them in order to harmonize definitions and practices in order to avoid this kind of thing. I love it. Thank you.
Thank you, Vanya. Anyone else, please? Any remarks? I don't see any. I would like to add a remark. I think that one of the areas that I've been involved recently, speaking out quite a bit, is about the global fight against corruption and other forms of malfeasance. And I think that that might be an interesting focus area for comparison. I understand that you have no CLAR there, but as Galen mentioned, inducements is also an important part. And as I said, there seems to be a lot of global attention and interest in that, and it might be relevant to add that as a focus point.
Yes, and other hands. Yes, thanks for that. Absolutely. Galen and Stavros, to your point as well, that's definitely an interesting area, and we can certainly add gifts and hospitality to the list, and induce tapping in there as well. Particularly as you note the importance of that, Stavros, that could be a good question for holders. Galen, with respect to the FAQs from the SEC, yeah, to the extent that that's where we find the answers, then we will certainly be looking into those as well. We're not intending to, kind of go through and cover off all of those in their entirety, but as you said, that's sometimes where the answers lie. So we will, fall in on those as we need to, for sure. And Vanya, thanks so much for your support. And just to sort of make sure that the context is clear, the intention of the project is not in any way to try to harmonize the standards themselves, but rather where we do see that there are, notable differences and things that the board can consider in the future. Those considerations, as I'll mention in a minute, we will be bringing those, compiling those kinds of observations and so on, and bringing those back to the board for future consideration and so on. So again, for that comment there as well.
If I may come in, I understand that, but for us that are dealing with that, we are writing new standards and regulations. It is very important for us to know what is already there. So it's a first point, a first basis to work on. And I understand that. Thank you, Laura.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, agreed. Knowing is a big part of it, for sure. Thanks.
I don't see any other raised hands, Laura.
Then thank you for the comments. And if you have any additional comments that come up, please, by all means, we're more than happy to receive them. We are looking for input. Please just reach out to myself or Sylvia if you do think of things. That'd be wonderful. And then if we can go to the next slide, that would be great. So just a quick note about the deliverables that we're expecting to come out of this project. And as I mentioned previously, we're conscious that the report is going to need to be as streamlined and succinct as possible to ensure that it's useful for stakeholders. So we're going to be structuring it in a way that is as user-friendly and as easy to navigate as possible. And at this point, we're anticipating that the final report will include an opening section, as I mentioned earlier, that explains the different approaches that are taken by the two sets of standards and summarizes the similarities and differences at that higher level, and then presents each topic area in summary form. The specifics of how much detail to include is something that we'll determine once we have the full set of working papers. It's still a bit of an open question, but at this point, we're imagining that the detailed mapping tables and working papers that we're preparing behind the scenes, we expect that those won't be directly published in the report, but that these tables could be provided to stakeholders if there's an area that they're looking for more detail and rationale on. And again, we're trying to find the balance that provides useful information without being overwhelming. And as I just mentioned as well in response to Vanya's question, we'll also be collecting those observations for the board in terms of items for future board consideration, and we'll pull those into a separate document for the board. And next slide, please. So then just to wrap up our piece for today, a quick look at next steps. We'll obviously be continuing the detailed evaluation work. We're making good progress there, and that's going to continue. And as I mentioned, we'll reach out to individual stakeholders as appropriate to ensure that we're addressing key areas of questions that come up and so on, and get answers when we need them. And again, if any of you have additional thoughts on this, please do send along your thoughts to Sylvia and myself. At the September CAG and board meetings, we'll provide our next update with some excerpts of what we anticipate the final report to look like, and some samples of the comparison work, and we're still targeting finalization of the report in Q4. Okay, and that brings us to the end of our update at this point. Thank you all, and I'll turn it back over to the chair now for any final questions or comments. Stavros.
Yes, thank you very much again. So any broader remarks, any comments on the overall theme? I see James. James.
Thank you very much. Laura, I just wanted to commend you on the approach. Maybe a general comment for the final report, and as you progress your work, the answer to the why. Why they may have chosen a particular path. We know why we have, but I think that's helpful. There may be, of course, a construct of the standards, or there may be specific circumstances that they are trying to address. But if you come across the rationale for the decision where they've decided to pursue a particular course of action, that's super helpful, not necessarily for inclusion. There's probably a long history behind them, but I think that insight will be very helpful as you perhaps have any supplemental material for the board. I think the why is the question that we would be reflecting on. There may be differences that are not relevant, therefore, from an international context, but there may be reasons or rationales that are, and I think that's puts the flavor to the differences on any significant differences. And if you come across those, please don't overlook, and if you could capture them, that would be of great benefit. Thank you.
Thank you, James. Any other remarks, please, on the update? I don't see any other hands. But I would like to add a comment, remark. First of all, I really commend you for very clearly putting out the choices and the methodology and moving away from a detailed mapping exercise that would really be very hard for anybody to follow and of not much use. I think the approach is correct. As James said, we have to answer the why, and as James did not say, but I will say, we have to say that we're only starting with the US, but that's not necessarily where we're stopping, that this is something that we will then continue and undertake the exercise with respect to other major jurisdictions, or jurisdictions where there are advanced markets and such as the EU and so forth. So we always have to keep in the back of our mind that what we do here is going to be the example and a guide to what we will do with other jurisdictions. Because in the end, I think we'll have, if this is successfully finished, I think we'll have a very valuable comparative picture for stakeholders in general that will include major jurisdictions and the code. And that will, on one hand, as you said, highlight similarities, on the other hand, differences and different approaches. So that's the second thing I would like to say, that we have to make sure that this is a process that will go on. I know you're stating that, I'm just underlining it because we have received some questions about precisely that. At this point, unless I see other hands from members, which I do not, I would like to ask Robert, our PIOB observer, to present his remarks. Robert?
Thank you, Stavros, and good day to everyone. Thank you, Laura, for a very concise and helpful presentation, and also to Lisbeth for the earlier presentation. I commend you both on the very fine communication of both of the projects and the clear direction that you've given to both of them. Just in relation to this project, it's there are some tricky public interest issues here, which I think the chairman has just alluded to. This is a very important piece of work, obviously in the public interest, but it has also, of course, been acknowledged both at previous meetings and again today that it comes with some risks in terms of perception and the need to keep it jurisdiction neutral, so to speak. So the revision of the objective is great, and that does help to address the risks, I think, Laura, and helps to confirm that there should be no misunderstanding that there's any intention to align or harmonise, I think was the term you used, the code with any particular national framework or to move the code away from the principles-based approach. So the aim of looking for areas of alignment, promoting awareness and also adoption of the code is important, and that seems the right direction to be signalling, and that should promote the public interest. The selection of focus areas is important, and there's a good range of areas there which is helpful to see. Just to Vanya's point, it was in my mind as well about the relevance of some of this work to ongoing work of the board. And of course, in the context of any project, and I'm sure it's already happened in the NAS project previously, what happens and what is done in other jurisdictions is looked at as part of the research-based and the evidence-based approach to revising the code provisions. So one would expect that would continue to proceed in the context of those work streams. So it's just important, it seems to me, to keep the separation between the objective of this project, which is really informative, awareness raising, and the ongoing business as usual research, looking at other jurisdictions which you'd expect any work stream to undertake. And then I guess behind the scenes, as I think was said, there's an opportunity for this project to perhaps inform, but without raising that perception that talked about before. So that would be worthwhile perhaps giving that some further thought, Chair, just in terms of maintaining that separation between this project and other projects which will draw on what's happening in other jurisdictions, and just making it clear that how the benefits can continue to be achieved from the project. So thank you very much. I very commend the project and look forward to seeing further developments from it. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Robert. And I will echo what you said, that this project, as all projects that we do, indeed should lead to greater awareness and strengthening the autonomy and the relevance of the code for all global stakeholders. So thank you indeed. So let me close this session. I want to thank Laura, the working group and the staff, Sylvia, and thank you all very much. Good work. And do we look forward to hearing from you again, Laura, in September? Yes. Yes. Okay.
Giving an update with some excerpts and more detail in terms of what the final deliverables will be.
Great, great. Thank you very much. So we have come to the end of our session today. Everything was very efficient and very well done. That reflects very well on the efforts of task forces, working groups, and staffs, and also the preparation of the board. So thank you all. Is there anything, Ken, that you have to add on the administrative side? We do have one more meeting, of course. It's a few days ahead of us. Anything else, Ken, that you would like to add at this point before I close?
No, not at this point. There is one open document for board review, and that is the draft minutes of the March public session. So if anyone has any comments, if you wouldn't mind sending those through to Astu, who will compile the comments. I think she's given the board until next Monday, and the board will be asked to approve the minutes on the last day, which is June 25th.
Right.
But otherwise, we'll reconvene with the board on June 25th, 9 a.m. Eastern time. We have two topics on the agenda. The first one is going to be tax planning. So we will receive the preliminary report and recommendations from the tax planning working group. So we will have Jens leading that presentation. And the second item on the agenda will be a detailed update from Mike Ashley on the PIPE project. We will be hearing back from the task force on its consideration of the significant comments on the exposure draft.
Yes. Thank you very much for that briefing, Ken, and thank you all. Time to close the session. Indeed, be well. See you soon again at our last session of this meeting, and thank you all very much. Good day, good afternoon, good evening, good night. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank
Be well.
you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Goodbye.